Stories are told in a variety of ways, being the culmination of humanity and its creativity. In books, they're written. In games, they're experienced. In film, they're seen. And I can't think of any other mediums as general as those ones. What I'm trying to say is, there are many ways to tell your story with no real wrong way to do so. However, within Genshin Impact, the lore is vast and expansive, yet hard to read up on sometimes. I'd like to effectively criticize this difficulty, but I'd like to remind you that, honestly, I didn't even say this is a massive problem. I just think it's worth covering, and I do believe it could be much better. Just look at how far Five Nights at Freddy's went when doing the same thing. Sorta. Also, this is my opinion, don't forget. On the surface of Genshin's story, it's all easily discoverable just by playing what is effectively the campaign of the game, as well as extra optional interlude acts that typically take place between the main chapters of the story. Most of the time, the storytelling is great, with only a few overly exposed, rushed, or confusing moments, typically happening in the later nations in my opinion. Also a lot of filler in the earlier nations. Something that Natlan's new Act 4 quest helped me realize, through its amazing quality, is the lack of any storytelling outside of cutscenes, dialogue, or reading of any kind. Typically, you need to read the story as you play, much like a visual novel, in comparison to games that tell the story through the environment and gameplay. Of course, it's important to use words to your advantage when developing a game, but there isn't much of a balance present, and I think it's important to mention when discussing the storytelling problem of Genshin Impact. There's also a great variety in Act 3 of Natlan's Archon quest, where it cuts between different perspectives, different time periods, and more, which makes reading significantly more interesting, similar to, for example, Sumeru's last act, or even the second act of Fontaine. Not far below this are story quests, typically being self-contained stories that do more service for the characters involved rather than increasing your knowledge on the lore of Teyvat, with a few exceptions, or something ambitious like that. There are only a few story quests within the game that are integral to knowing more of the overarching lore, and world quests are a different story for later. Just know the surface is handled relatively well, though it's lacking in a lot of the knowledge that I'd honestly assume a chunk of the player base doesn't know exist to begin with. Keep in mind, a lot of these obscurities will most likely be surface level as time goes on, like future harbingers slowly becoming present harbingers. Now, let's dive into it. Firstly, outside of the game, funnily enough, a lot of necessary lore and overall just things that are handled better show themselves on Genshin Impact's social media accounts. Things like a Winter Night's Lazo are pretty much mandatory for anybody who cares slightly for the storyline, and while the social media accounts are accessible to every degree, having a game's story be told outside of the game sometimes is a questionable decision. There's no problem with doing this, as it can add to or tailor a more unique experience at times. It can also be the bane of some players' existences. In a similar vein to this, the Genshin Impact manga is a slightly more obscure piece of media that can be found with a quick Google search, being like a prologue of sorts to both Sumeru and Mondstadt. It has Kaya, Amber, Lisa, Jean, Venti, Collei, Sino, Dottore, even Diluc. That's not on the script, I forgot him initially, but I just remembered him, as well as other characters that are more important to the lore, though not on the surface of the game's story itself. It's a simple story of Dottore manipulating Mondstadt, the nation fighting back, and Collei, an escaped experimentee of Dottore's, escaping his shackles and finding her way into the city of Mondstadt. It's not integral to the lore of Teyvat, but I'd consider it to be integral to the characters of Sumeru and whole of Mondstadt, being another must-read for people who are more invested in the lore than most, as well as being important for Dottore fans, like me. Other examples are things like Arlecchino's animated short being recycled into pictures for her story quest, effectively being a dumbed-down version of something that could have been put in game one way or another. Instead, the writers expect you to be actively checking social media accounts and other releases instead of just playing the game, which to me is a little bit bum. Like, they probably put the pictures in there assuming that you'd know what the pictures came from, kind of like how I put clips of the game in because I assume you know what I'm talking about. However, let's continue down this path of obscurity. A lot of lore is in artifacts, books, and other items, such as elemental shards even. Crazy, huh? Even the slimes are a good indicator of what's going to happen with the Archons. Now, I think having lore and items is cool. Being able to research things and experience the world like you would any real world is very immersive, being able to actually read books that were made by fictional characters. It's just very immersive and real, adding more and more layers to Teyvat, and making it feel very alive with each small detail considered when crafting the lore and origins for various parts of the world. However, on the contrary to this, there are two problems that not only do I feel, but I'm sure others feel, like my biology teacher. Firstly is the overwhelming nature of the lore. Now, I think Hoyoverse handles this one fine, as most lore is not integral to other pieces of the story, but I do worry that these things will become more relevant over time, requiring you to research deeper, whether you're casual or not, just to have a basic understanding of what exactly is unfolding in front of you at each given moment of time. Actually, recently this has happened in the 4th act of Natlan, when there are mentions of shades, and there are mentions of the fake sky that was shot into by Mawika. Now, I actually loved seeing this as I know a bit of this stuff, but still, to the casual player, even me partially, it's a bit confusing and comes out of nowhere with no real build-up behind it. It's just a random little quirk that happened, which in most people's eyes in any other situation would be considered bad writing, or at least mediocre writing. I was like a little baby watching it, and I would be even more of a little baby if it continued to happen, and I don't really like that idea, I'm going to be for real with you. You think I want an anime gacha game to condescend me like that? Hell no. My point is, not every player wants to look into the tens of hundreds of items descriptions, or books that detail lore that could have been represented better, but I'll get into that very soon, don't you worry. Now, the second problem is just basic obscurity. If these things were minor extras all the time, then I wouldn't care, but storytelling is inconsistent. You know Neuvillette was teased all the way back in 2.4? Did you know that Arlecchino was teased in a similar time frame? Or that Teyvat is most likely in a samsara cycle? Oh, don't forget the banger fact of Signora's entire lore being hidden behind artifact descriptions and only an official proper mainstream media just dying off. Yeah, this is the problem. Not only do certain things cause the first problem, but once they do, it's also doing a massive disservice to things that deserve more exposition, whether it's in events, story quests, or Archon quests. Overall, it's just not on. Now, I just mentioned events, so let's discuss the problem with them. It was something that was endlessly brought up in the comments of my Genshin Impact's character problem video. Well, you've heard of FOMO, right? Fear of missing out? It's a tactic used by many people and things, especially in the realm of marketing and advertising. Telling somebody that they have a limited time to get or purchase something, whether that be in general or for a cheaper price, is an effective way to get them to go through with the decision, and Genshin Impact uses this to an extent with how they handle their storyline, which has upset many players in the past and still continues to do so. Every version, a new series of event quests are released, typically following multiple familiar, new or upcoming characters on various journeys in the existing or sometimes even new parts of Teyvat. Like Charlotte from Fontaine was shown in later quests from the Sumeru versions. However, these events can be to varying degrees of importance, with one of the first events to take place in the game quite literally introducing the sixth of the Fatui Harbingers, the Balladeer, who didn't come back out till Inazuma, which was like a year later. Due to this business model that they follow, it makes certain pieces of the in-game storyline and lore increasingly more obscure by the month, with this fact only being known by a chunk of the player base. On top of even all of this, story quests and event quests are all optional, which means the effects of the quest can only go so far when playing other quests because they can't guarantee you've played them. They've already shown this where they introduce characters with a little name card now when you see them for the first time. The only time this has really ever happened was when you met Scaramouche and Inazuma, but depending on if you did the event or not, the dialogue would be different, and he wouldn't get properly introduced in that scene, but rather the other scene. There's a level of culture that comes with obscurity, with things like iceberg videos proving this, but more often than not, putting important pieces of characters or lore in limited time optional events can prove to be more of a negative than a positive for the game's storytelling. Even full zones like Simulanka are hidden behind this temporary wall, and in my opinion it can be baffling, and it is baffling. Now, world quests. World quests are extremely inconsistent, with some, mostly older ones, being fetch quests. However, as the game moves away from RPG storytelling and more to gacha sales, world quests are becoming increasingly more forced to take on the mantle of storytelling that once came through things like the environment and surface level exposure. In general, world quests have become more mandatory for a satisfactory user experience since Inazuma, being required to unlock full sectors of the maps nowadays. Look at Natlan and Sumeru especially. Lore-wise, things like that same samsara cycle, hints to Harbinger's origins, and full-blown hidden gigantic bits of the world you walk on are hidden behind these quests, with that being completely fine in my opinion due to the fact that they are all accessible as hell, usually. However, my problem is their commitment to consistency. See, world quests also lead the stories of sub-regions, with Dragonspine, the Chasm, Enkanomiya, Chenyu Vale, and the Sea of Bygone Eras all having their own mini-campaigns. The problem I have is how tedious these quests are, typically having bland character designs, character writing, and mediocre storytelling at best due to the lack of voice acting. Now, my favourite story quests for expansions is probably Enkanomiya and Chenyu Vale, because they have memorable characters like Fujin and Little Mao, as well as the best character in all of fiction, that's an exaggeration, the best character that is only in story quests, usually, being Enjo, the most memorable member of the Abyss Order that I'm pretty sure returns in Natlan, but I'm not entirely sure. The problem I have is how tedious these quests are. Even the Nara quest, I did that shit, and the Golden Slumber quest, typically having bland character designs, character writing, and mediocre storytelling, though this becomes less in Chenyu Vale and Enkanomiya because memorable characters like Enjo, Little Mao, and Fujin are there. However, they all fall short due to the lack of voice acting. The reason Archon quests are so good is of course because of the writing, but also the animations, voice acting, cutscenes, and pacing, which is typically neglected in world quests, mainly just serving to be a way to learn more about the world, with the journey being ignored and the goal being being more focused on. The composers literally make full albums for the areas but can't even voice. Most people just do them to unlock parts of the world or Primogems, skipping over the dialogue and then watching summaries later, which proves my point. I typically pay attention, but not in the same way I would when I do Archon quests. It's less like watching a movie and more like I want to fall asleep. I almost did when I was finishing up the Chasm story quest. On top of this, if the Archon quests and story quests were guilty of not using the game itself to its advantage, then don't get me started on what these story quests do. There is little to no storytelling outside of the dialogue. I want to move on to what is effectively one big story quest with an actually large amount of environmental storytelling. There's just one
The fate of this world is already sealed.
It's hidden. Yeah, hidden. Enkanomiya, the area I mentioned earlier on, the second sub-region to release after the Dragonspine and before the Chasm, is the least exposed expansion on the map. Even less exposed than fucking Vanarana, which is just a big black spot on my map, or even the Lost Nursery. Oh my god. Dragonspine is very clearly shown since the very beginning of the game, the Chasm has 2 voice-acted quests, as well as being clearly shown on the map, and the Sea of Bygone Eras has Hydroculi, which automatically makes it vital to progressing in the game. Dragonspine also has story quests that take place inside of it, as well as multiple events that take place inside of it. However, Enkanomiya is completely different, with the only in-game reasons and hints to it even existing being its story quest, and the materials from the boss found inside it. Besides that, I don't know of any other things that are still around, from my viewpoint, and my viewpoint is the most important one. It's the most beautiful one you can find in Genshin. A whole expansion of the map, with arguably the most relevance to the lore of Teyvat, is a secret. I said this in my Enkanomiya video, but it reminds me a lot of the Hive and Hollow Knight. Lovely to put so much effort into content that may never be found by the average player, but that amount of content should be easily accessible too, right? On top of that, it's in Inazuma, the most gate-kept nation of them all. Mentioned it in my last video. That's pretty much double trouble then. 2 negatives don't make a positive. I just feel like the storytelling and execution of the game can be a bit flawed. Even the lore of the world, as while I like how it's in depth and spans over a long time, where do I start when all of it is being told through YouTube videos due to all the problems I mentioned beforehand? Near nobody actually goes into the game to research this stuff unless they're making content or have reserved over 70% of their brain for remembering this stuff. It's more exhausting than Undertale AUs at times. Yeah, those things. I just wanted to bring this up considering the main problem I have with storytelling is the variety and accessibility. They actively make it hard to get into certain world quests, and even Archon quests when you need to constantly rank up or do mandatory story quests in 2 of the 6 existing nations. Of course, there's a lot of good, but when most of the content is raiding, half of the in-game storyline as a whole lacks basic voice acting, events are limited time, and story quests require the completion of other story quests as well as commission keys, then is it really designed as well as people think it is? The pacing improves significantly later on, as well as by the time you're in Sumeru. Ranking up probably isn't a problem, and the writing in general improved significantly. I'm very tired when recording this, not gonna lie. You can probably tell by my voice, but I'm prepared for a lot of disagreements. Just feel like things could be handled better. Even the newest quests have characters without their voices at all, and while it's not at all the writer's faults, it does show how important voice acting is. People are fully changing languages just to hear a voice of some sort with every piece of dialogue, so did they not go wrong with world quests? I mean, it's that to a whole new level. I want to hear my Tapetlosaurus, Oily Boy, roar when it says rar. I spelled them differently. Anyway, that's it. Peace out, guys. Just want to discuss that. Bye!